welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here. I'm Anno Saxenian. I'm Dean of the School of Information. Welcome to our last Dean's Lecture for the school year. This is a really special opportunity for us as we welcome Dr. Andy Brooks to the iSchool. Andy graduated from the iSchool in 2010. He got a Master's of Information Management and Systems degree, and then he got his PhD in 2017 and disappeared into the world of geospatial intelligence. Yes, he wrote a dissertation called Decision Making Under Radical Uncertainty, a multiple case comparison of companies creating new technologies featuring new forms of personal data. That's a mouthful.
I can tell you all about it.
Yes. Andy was also really instrumental in forming our Masters of Information and Data Science, our MIDS degree, for which we continue to be appreciative, especially the class on research design, data analysis and applications, right? RDATA, fondly known as. Andy now has the greatest title. He is a chief data scientist at the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, where he delivers high-impact geospatial data science-related intelligence capabilities to decision makers around the world. He's going to be discussing part of that with us today, and he encourages us to ask probing questions of any sort. Don't be shy in the Q&A. Please join me in welcoming Andy back to the iSchool.
It's really exciting to be back. So it's just, it's a little bit more of my history background. Grew up here in the Bay Area, worked in the tech startup world, the first .com, date me. Worked in a software startup down Telegraph Avenue and saw South Hall and the Campanile, and I hired somebody who then came from the iSchool, and I was like, someday I'll go there. So I went and got my master's. That was awesome, had some amazing experiences. Went back into industry for a little bit, worked at Yahoo Research, and then was like, I kind of want to go back to the iSchool. So I did, and then got my PhD, as Anno mentioned, and then graduated, and kind of took a while looking around, like, what do I want to do? Every company that I'd worked for, everything I'd done was like, in retrospect, was trying to figure out how do you create value out of new forms of data. It could be like supply chain data, totally boring, but really cool once you get into it, right? That kind of stuff. Nonprofit fundraising data I worked on. I was at a data broker when the iPhone came out. So talking about now, it's kind of quaint where it's like, oh, it's your location and you can track that all the time. That was bonkers back when. How do you do that? Like, what do you do? And I was always a product manager in those roles, doing that kind of thing. We've got some sort of data. What are we going to do with this thing, right? That's what my dissertation was about, too. I looked at heart rate variability data. So collecting heart rate fitness data. How do you create value out of that? Those sorts of things. How did I end up here? Doing the same thing. So I apply all of what I've done through those years, every single course, out of the program here in my daily work for what I do, which is at NGA, so National Geospatial-Intelligence. I'm going to take you through more of what I do, what my colleagues do, the kind of threats and challenges we face, some of the things that we're working on that we can talk about publicly. There's a lot more that we can't talk about publicly, which is really unfortunate because it's a great story that needs to be told and can be told, and we want to have a discourse discussion about that. This is the start. So we're going to try and start having these sorts of conversations about what we're wrestling with and what we're facing, and how that's kind of, I would say, similar in many ways to other organizations who are collecting and analyzing data. So to jump in, the first one is looking at, let's talk about the world today, right? So that's a huge encompassing space from national security world. I'll go into more detail who I work for and what we do as part of the Department of Defense. But for general national security, we've got stuff like this, big nation-state actors, right? So this is, a photograph of a ICBM from North Korea, right? Kind of traditional Cold War era type adversaries. What are we going to do from a national security perspective for things like that, right? That's one thing that we're dealing with. Not exactly new, just maybe different people who are involved. Other things we've got. Non-state actors, and you can call them quasi-state actors. I don't know if people know the story or the background of Mark I Plumbing, right? Interesting. Guy sold his pickup truck, I think to an auctioneer or something like that, and ended up in the battlefield. I forget where this is, but became like a meme, right? But what this is showing is this is the other types of adversaries that we've got and what they're working with, right? These are not big, huge ICBMs and things like that. We call it technical. It's a pickup truck with a gun on the back. There's no badges. No one's wearing a uniform or anything like that. What do we do about that? That is a challenge. Also in our history, we've got, we're still going after and trying to find people. So I don't know if people know who this guy is. He was the mastermind behind the USS Cole bombing. This was before 9/11 happened, right? This is when Al-Qaeda was doing things to the West, right? This is one of the guys who was the orchestrators of that. And he's an individual who was hunting around a person that we recently got, right, a couple years ago. My agency had a role in doing parts of that. Other types of adversaries that we face. This one you go, it's like, why are you showing a building? So this is really where the Chinese cyber operations are based. I think it's in Shanghai. I forget if it's Shanghai or Beijing. But that's what the is we're facing adversaries like that. Folks who are a state actor in some degree, but then also non-state actors. What's the Russian one? I can't, Fuzzy Bear, Cozy Bear, Fancy Bear. That one of those derivations of the Care Bears. Those are the types of adversaries that we face as well. So we have all those kind of complex things, plus other climate change, other sorts of bits. At the same time, we've got, we'll call this artificial intelligence. Right? When you put that into Google, what comes back for artificial intelligence, right? And it's one of these where it's just like, we have a tremendous volume of data. We have new compute. We've got all sorts of new sorts of techniques to work with, right? We're all kind of doing it. Let's admit this, as data scientists out there, we're all kind of doing this for the first time and getting smarter about how we do it. A lot of it's getting oversold. I'll call it as bumper stickers of like artificial intelligence. Then you're like, really? We're doing simple basic stuff, right? At the end of the day, everybody, right? But it's one of these where we deal with this expectation of what AI can do, and we, just like others, are facing this challenge of like, how do we find people who have done this or who have the capability to learn how to do it? Like for the first time, how do we get these sort of folks cleared? Things like that. We face that just like any other organization, right? We have some additional challenges for having to get a clearance where we're located and things like that, but this is the world that we're operating in, right? It's a bit of a challenge. In my space, I'll go into a little bit more, is one of, this is very difficult to see here with the lighting, but that's a picture of the Earth, right? Taken at night. And what those dots are on there are all different new types of satellites up in space right now. Hard to see, but I don't know if folks are familiar with Planet Labs over in San Francisco. We build satellites, not we, but Planet Labs builds satellites in San Francisco. I've been to their factory. It's fascinating. It's like Willy Wonka. You know, you go in there and they're making these little like small, tiny satellites, not cube satellites that other companies do, but they loft these things into space, which is really, really cool, right? Because we can get all sorts of new imagery, learn all sorts of things about who we are. It can be a picture, other sorts of sensors, things like that. That's kind of a challenge too, because before we were the only ones who could, I would describe it, loft a big bird up into the sky, you know, some of our partners that I'll go into, and take pictures of things, and now it's like, they're just pumping these things out. And the real bandwidth right now is how many satellites can you put on a SpaceX rocket, and things like that, right? And this is changing radically too. What's really exciting is we're starting with still imagery, but I've had conversations with folks who are working on full motion video on demand, which is like straight out of science fiction, right? So it's like, they give you a demo where it's like, you'll sit with your phone and you'll be like, South Hall now, and you can do it. Like you can get pretty decent resolution of what's happening right now with very minimal delay, right? So that's kind of exciting and also a bit of a challenge for those of us in the national security world, because before, we were the only ones who were able to do things like that. It's a challenge and an opportunity. Some background on just the intelligence community in general. Department of Defense. So I think there's 16 agencies in this circle and in this ring of folks who are part of the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. You can start at the top, like the CIA, you can go all the way around. Homeland Security, you interact with, like at the airport, there's the FBI, Department of Justice, Department of the Treasury. My agency right over here is NGA, over in the corner with the globe. Right above there is the National Reconnaissance Office, so they put satellites up in space for the government. NSA you're familiar with, and I mentioned CIA. So there's a lot of different folks who are working on these sorts of problems, right? And these challenges that we have going forward. I can't tackle all of these. I interact with a lot of these folks on a daily basis. I'm going to talk about what NGA is doing and how we're sharing that with other folks. So let's dive into who NGA is. So we're the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency. It's a mouthful, right? What do? We deliver world-class geospatial intelligence that provides a decisive advantage to policymakers, warfighters, intelligence professionals, and first responders, right? Let's break that apart a little bit. What is GeoInt? I call it anything with a longitude, latitude, and a timestamp. That's geospatial data, right? Historically, it would be a photograph. So if you go way back in the history of our predecessor agencies, a plane would fly overhead, or a satellite would go overhead, and we would take one picture, right? And then if you're familiar with like the Corona program, there was some wild stuff, how they would drop it out of space and catch it with an arrow, and then they would analyze that, and you get one picture of something, right? That was the reality of what that is. Right now, we're dealing with much more different types and volumes of data, things like that are coming in. The agency itself is about 14,500 folks distributed between a couple different locations, primarily outside of Washington, D.C., folks in St. Louis, and then we've got folks, as I described it, deployed at various locations around the world. We have units who are co-located with military units, things like that, providing them with geospatial intelligence as, say, they're planning operations, things like that. So we really have a global distributed workforce who are using these products. I'm one of the few folks who's not based there permanently. I'm based in San Francisco. I travel a lot, but it's one of my engagements are going to the folks in DC to learn about what they're doing and then visiting our users, so-called downrange, so to speak, about what they're using with data and how they do it. I'll go into more detail with that. As part of the DoD, our budget is classified, so I can't go into details over that. That's who we are and that's what we do. Applying a little bit more of who we are and what we do, are folks familiar with what this is, or any idea what this is, right? So this is where it is. It's in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and this is where Osama Bin Laden was hiding. Okay, what is this? So my agency helped build this and create this model. When you go like, how did you do that, right? I mean, it was a coercive, a cooperative effort amongst the CIA and the NSA and other sorts of folks to figure out where we thought he might be living, what he might be doing, and detecting a pattern of life, so the things that he did. We used various sorts of sensors, let's say, overhead, things like that, to come up with like, well, what is this place? Who really lives here? Right? Because we're trying to find this guy. This has been taking like a really long time. So we worked together and cooperated with other folks to go, well, we think this is maybe the spot, based on these certain factors and things that haven't been declassified, and came to a time where we're like, well, we think this is really it, so what are we gonna do? Like, how are we gonna go get him? How are we gonna go capture him? Things like that. So some folks at NGA, we literally have a model shop, built a scale replica model of the compound. So all of the little detail there, right? So like imagine like your elementary school project where you had to build a mission or something like that. This is super high stakes because they built a model like this and they use this in briefings to really paint this, illustrate a picture of like, okay, here's where we think he is. Here's where we think the movements are. And then what's really kind of cool too is they took this model and built a full-size replica, right? Because no one had ever been here. This is Pakistan, sovereign country, can't go practice and things like that. So the team that went in there to go do the raid itself built a model out some location and tested and ran it, right? And it was pretty close to what the reality was when they actually got on the ground. So that's the kind of stuff like the agency does. That's a super focused big example. But the way I describe it is like we take all these different types of geospatial data, suck it in, analyze it, and provide some sort of actionable information to a decision maker. And it could be like in this case, kind of call them internally door kickers, who are literally like kicking a door, and it's like what's going on in there? We need to go get somebody. All the way on the scale to the president, right? Presidents look at this sort of information in their presidential daily brief, to disaster response, which is kind of a story that we don't tell a whole lot. Our agency does some wild stuff on disaster response. Something happens in the world, and they're going to be like, well, we want to fly in some supplies, right? Are the runways open? We keep track of every runway in the world and whether it's open or not, right? What we can also look at too is like, well, has the runway been damaged? Well, how short is the runway now? Okay, we have some really smart people who can do all the math to figure out what's the maximum laden weight of an aircraft that could land there, do things like that. So when you think about disaster response, it's pretty insane, like the types of things that we do, and we're hoping to tell more of that story. We also do it with wildlife trafficking, things like that. How do we go and track down poachers, or people who are moving products around the world illegally? We can gather this sort of information, and we do that. That's part of our charter for national security. I talked about this a little bit, just kind of the workflow of what happens. We call this our tradecraft in the agency itself, and this happens in the CIA and the NSA. We have a tradecraft, right? Highly documented process for how we do this, right? Starting over on the left-hand side, so there's the collect aspect of things. I'll be clear, is like when it comes to collect, like we go to like the National Reconnaissance Office or others to do the collection, and then they bring it to us. So we analyze that. So we get things from satellites, we get overhead imagery, which is the airplane. We'll get stuff from partners, some of our Five Eyes partners in the intelligence community will provide us some data. And then we will get open data, go out and find stuff on the open internet, bring those sorts of things together. Next step in the process is we analyze it. Traditionally, that's been done by humans. Like I mentioned, like we would get a picture of something and someone would look at it and be like, what's in the picture? Right? Is it a tank? Is it a rocket launcher? What do we think these people are doing? Things like that. Increasingly now, we're stepping much more into using artificial intelligence, and I can really unpack what I mean there by that. But we're starting to use more and more technology to analyze this stuff. Part of what that is, like I mentioned, is that we're not getting one photo a day or 2 photos a day or something, we're getting tremendous volumes of data. We're getting straight up sensor data off of different forms of radar that like don't visualize, like you can't look at a picture of these sorts of things very easily. So we're using a lot of technology there to help people figure out what's there to do the analysis. And we distribute things. So you can start at the very top. We're colloquially known as the map people. When I go and meet with our door kickers and our warfighters and stuff, they're like, you guys are the ones who give us the maps. We go like, yeah, we do other things, but that's what we've historically done. I can get you a map of anywhere in the world, super high res, if you want to do something like that, right? Also we do is, this is the closest I could get to a report. So someone will go and say like, hey, what's going on in this part of the world? Our analysts together, look at the imagery, look at the human geography and things like that, and come up with a report. Here's the state of what's going on in a certain part of the world. Give you that. Like I mentioned, we can give you a picture, get you a picture of most anything from overhead. And then increasingly too is we're just getting folks raw data. In the sense of like, hey, we brought this in from this source, we've maybe analyzed it, we've cleaned it up, we've done some analysis, looks like you have a different sort of question, boom, here, you take the data, do your own analysis with it. So that's pretty much the flow of what we've got. Kind of going back a little bit to the challenges that we face in doing this type of work, kind of just bringing them together. I mentioned the adversaries, all the different types of folks who are posing challenges to us, whether they have a uniform, don't have a uniform, different tools and technologies that we've got. I mentioned like workforce skills, right? How do we find, just like many companies, like how do you find the right people who know how to use these technologies for real? Stakes are pretty high, so you can't kind of like really experiment a whole lot. You can't kick down the wrong door, that kind of stuff. We sit on a tremendous amount of data, right? Like an agency that's been around a long time. I kind of phrase it as a data debt, in the sense that if you're familiar with technology debt or technical debt, we've amassed this data over time. It's been tagged, and you can go totally iSchool on this whole thing on how it's structured and metadata and all that kind of stuff, and it's very well intended, but not always up to par in different ways. So we're sitting on all this data, but it's like, what can we do with it? Like we need to clean these sorts of things up. So we have this debt that we're sitting on, like organizations that have been around a long time. We have all this tremendous new forms of data. I mentioned like full motion video coming. That's crazy, like the potential volume of data that could be coming. But then also too, is I'll just describe it as other types of sensors that are coming online. We're just from a remote sensing standpoint. We see many of these sorts of things are created here at Berkeley and other institutions where you can point a sensor at something and get entirely new types of data about what's going on there, right? That's all of interest to us who analyze this sort of data. One I didn't go into too far, but we will, is the ethical part of this, of what is going on and how we're using data. I mentioned our Tradecraft and what we do, how we collect and analyze and these sorts of things. That's a very super structured and well-documented process, and I would say it's a very social process. If you're making a decision about, are we gonna advise this team of folks to literally get in a helicopter tonight and go do something, right? And we're not sitting with them, we're somewhere remote. It's a very social process where you kind of come through. What is our confidence index? What is our interval? Like, how confident do we feel about doing this sorts of stuff? How do we do this? As we bring in new technologies, well, that kind of maybe social process, how do those technologies fit together? When you've got an algorithm in the sense of we sitting together and making this decision, and then you've got a technical algorithm sitting over here. Is it a black box? Is it a white box? Who can see it? Lots of questions, right? And I'll go into more detail on that. And then just these new technologies that are coming. Not just like Jupyter, Python, and all that kind of stuff, but like much more advanced sort of things coming. Add them all up, and they're like super challenges that we're trying to face. That's my role at the agency, is not to do all these, but it's just one of like, help folks figure out how to do this, right? If you had skipped the whole beginning part of what I talked about, like in my agency, there's a lot of organizations who face similar sorts of challenges in doing this. Maybe adversaries, you could say, are competitors, but in the cyberspace, there's definitely, adversaries for any sort of company that's out there. So there's other folks who are doing this. One of my aims in the work that I do is break kind of that mold of, hey, we're in the Department of Defense, hey, we're in the intelligence community, everything's secret. Some stuff is, but like stuff like this, no, we should be talking with other people and learning from other people who are doing these similar sorts of things. How do you train your workforce? I was just talking to Anno about this today. What are the ethical issues that you've got? How do you draw down data debt? We can't be by ourselves trying to solve these problems. We've really got to engage. My hypothesis really on how we can do this and start heading these things off is looking at 3 things. Initiatives related to our people, and I'll explain what that is, our data, go into more detail there, and then our technology. And really this lens comes out of, it's like iSchool, kind of style of things. What is information school? What do we do? I always frame it as, we do people, data, and technology, the intersection of those things, right? Plus others, but like, let's focus on that. I'm gonna take you through some of the initiatives that we're doing to help figure out and address these challenges. First one on the people front. This is kind of a hard picture to show. So this is the building that I work in, or it's based in DC. And I'm going to talk about our people. One that's kind of tricky in the intelligence community is there's not a whole lot of pictures of people, right? For security reasons, we don't put our pictures out. I'm public, so you can see who it is. Many of my colleagues are not. For security reasons, they don't want to put their names out there. I totally respect that. This is our building out in the Springfield, Washington, D.C. area. Amazing, beautiful, one of the most recent buildings done in the intelligence community. We have big windows and stuff. It's great. That's not the point. The point really is the people aspect of what we're trying to do. So when I was hired into the agency, I founded a team called Data Corps. And Data Corps' mission is to go out there and, considering all the challenges, go out and solve everyday sort of data problems, right? What do we mean by that? I'll go into more detail. But it was when I started, there was a team of 4 or 5, I think it was 5 of us. And over the course of about 9 months, we hired 70-some people, into the agency. That's a lot. That's really fast to do that, getting them cleared and things like that. And who we hired for that was all data professionals. And I'll say data professionals, air quotes, for what it is. Because the mission and charter of this team and what they do is go out and listen to those users who are trying to do things with data, right? Let's take that like bumper sticker of artificial intelligence and bring it all the way down to we have an analyst who's dealing with a whole lot of images that are coming in, and they're interested in using new program technologies, and there's a way that they can do it, and they need some help. Right? That's what this team does. So like a team of 3, 4, 5 people will go and sit with those users, throughout our building, even folks downrange, things like that, and really sit there from a very like user experience research, user-centered design kind of style of ethnography. I won't call it capital E ethnography for the academics, but sitting there and listening, right? Not as a consultant and kind of just maybe sitting and leaning and being like, and then disappearing. Like, no, the charter of this team, and this is the iSchool vision in this, is no, you go and you sit with these folks. Right? You really try and get some empathy with what the challenges that they're facing, how hard it is, what sort of technical skills they have, what they're interested in learning, and helping them solve that problem themselves. So the folks on this team, originally the charter was go hire a whole bunch of data scientists. And I was like, nope, we don't need a whole bunch of data scientists. You need a handful of data scientists, and what do you mean by a data scientist? So I broke it apart as like data professionals, and I called it that. Are you literate in data, right? Well, we hired into different sorts of work roles. So of course we had data scientists, and we have a handful of those folks, or a smaller group, who are true like algorithm writers, things like that. We have data engineers who are doing the pipes, building the systems, right, to really be able to bring in data, to be able to give people tools and places to analyze it, doing that. We have data analysts who work on preparing and getting the data ready, writing some scripts and things like that. And one that I love that I don't find in other places yet, and I really think we're going to have this soon, is data stewards. And people are like, what's a data steward? I talk to my friends in industry and they're like, that's nuts. And a data steward is someone that we've kind of had in the agency for a while. And their job really is to focus on how do we make sure the data is clean, it's got metadata, it's tagged, it's labeled, it adheres to all sorts of rules, with regard to collection, right? Because we're not allowed to collect any data about US persons, right? So making sure that we have all of that kind of stuff that for a lot of people is really boring, but like high schoolers know, some people really nerd out on metadata. Like, we have a bunch of those folks, so if you're interested in metadata, this is the place. So we have those groups of 4 people that go in and do this type of work, right? So we have those 4 work roles: scientists, stewards, analysts, and engineers. But also too, as I mentioned, like they have a lot of like user experience research background. They've got some design background, maybe a little bit, and they teach it and they learn it and they do these sorts of things to be able to go out there and solve these sorts of problems, right, for the agency. And like I mentioned, this has only been going about a year and a half. Really small. But has grown to, I mentioned the staff, about 70-some people who are out there throughout the agency solving these sorts of problems. Simple, small stuff that wouldn't surprise you. How do I clean up this? How do I get something out of a spreadsheet into other sorts of systems? To someone who's truly much more advanced, who's sitting there being like, what are the trade-offs between using this computer vision algorithm and that one, right? You're like, great, we're going to have a test, and run it. So it's a full-scale scope of what we're trying to do. Why are we trying to do this, right? Why are we solving problems in this way? Is to get it as, if we want to have the workforce with the skills to be able to do this, if we want them to be able to think in new and different ways, we got to teach them how to do this, right, themselves, to be able to solve these sorts of problems and recognize that the challenges that they face are not just, hey, let's throw some artificial intelligence on top of that. That's pretty disconnected. Let's start with the baseline. What are the problems that people face every day so that they can be more successful in what they do, right? And that's like super cool. Like when you sit down with someone who's been facing some sort of challenge, right? Because at the end of the day, it's like these are regular analysts who are trying to solve a problem, right? They're trying to make a decision. Do we advise that we do this or do we do that? And they're getting all this new information, and how do they do it? And we give them tools to do it, and the light will go off. And they'll be like, I hadn't thought of doing it that way. Like, oh my God, this allowed me to save so much time. in what they do. Maybe take a manual process and speed it up dramatically. Can't really disclose numbers on what that is, but just one where it's like, imagine in a week, all of a sudden you had a couple free days. What would you do, right? And doing that like at scale for large parts of the organization to be able to do this sort of work. As I describe it, the whole mission of this team is really get those folks to be able to use technology in interesting ways, to get to the more like advanced hard questions that they would debate about at the water cooler or like at lunch. You know, you maybe had those sorts of things. You do your work and then out of there you're gonna go like, oh man, what if we could do this? Or what if we could do that? You know, and I go like, the job of this team is to get to that. How do we help you get the time and space and tools and technology to really ask those crazy super questions that you're maybe interested in doing, right? That's the goal of this team. I founded and started that team. That was one of the reasons I was brought on there. It got very big and mature. Remember, I'm based in San Francisco, so we transferred over to 2 folks who run it inside the agency there and have continued to scale it, and it's just truly amazing. One of the things I'm working with them on is getting it is like, we need to share their stories of how they did these things, right? Some of them are classified, so we can't talk about the space, but how they solved it, what they solved, the means that they did it, what worked and what didn't work, those apply everywhere. So one of the next talks I want to do at some point here in other places is start telling those stories of these folks and how they did it, how they solved these problems. So that's number one in the people aspect of what we're trying to do. The second one we're wrestling with is this question of ethics. And it's like, that's a broad space, right? Like, what do we mean by ethics? We're not the only ones. It's all in the press. You know, are there industry groups? Are there working groups? Are there panels? Things like that. Do we bring in experts about how to do it? Here's my stance. You'll notice here, it's a circle, right? Like, what do I mean by having a circle? This is literally the way that we're just starting to do this and to have this conversation. So is it experts coming in and talking about what ethics are and what they mean? There's some of that, but really what it is getting folks together. I mentioned like the analysts will get together and have a conversation about what do we think is gonna happen, you know, if we make this sort of decision and sussing that out. It's a conversation in a circle. And that sounds kind of weird, but it's like that's our vision of what we're trying to roll out inside the agency is bringing together, yes, experts who have studied this, yes, philosophers, technical folks who really know what the possibilities are, people who are very well versed in the tradecraft, and the analysts and those folks together and having a discussion conversation. And really owning that, like, we're trying to figure this out. You know, just as industry is trying to figure it out, no one has completely figured it out, and we're all very well-intentioned in trying to figure out the ethical use of the technology and what we're doing, right? And this can get pretty heavy, right? Because it's one where it's like, in industry, you'll maybe have, what are the ethics of, say, doing ad targeting in a certain sort of way, right? Some ethical implications of those sorts of things. This is higher stakes when you think about, or different stakes. I don't want to say it's more or less. It's just different because like here you have this question of like, we will make decisions or analysts will make decisions that could have very negative consequences for some people, right? I'll put it that way, right? Like these are really high stakes decisions. We're gonna put people in risk's way. What are the ethics of providing a recommendation or advice or direction to someone who's going to go get in something where if they get hurt, they could get very hurt or they could die, right? And it's just like, what are the ethics of using technology in that, right? I'm not gonna pretend to know the answer, right? Who knows the answer? I would say is the people who are in that circle who are coming together and having a discussion and a debate and an argument about what the right role and use of technology in the space and work that we do. So this is one is, we're starting this kind of conversation pretty small. So we've got, every year we have our GeoInt consortium, like a of when all the people who work in this space get together. And we're starting this, a handful of us, as a discussion, like a breakout session. You know, are you interested in the ethics of geospatial and artificial intelligence? Like, come on over here. We're gonna come talk, you know, and listen. And hear what those thoughts are, and really kind of try and get that conversation going from that standpoint, really from the practitioners who do that. We have legal counsel who are coming in, I mentioned analysts who are coming in, all different sorts of ranks, different sorts of technical backgrounds, and really like having not just a listening session, but like a discussion, a debate, and a dialogue, and figuring out, okay, what are we gonna do next coming out of this? So that's start one. That's one too, is I think at a certain point as we get some progress is coming back and sharing that with other folks. Feels pretty well informed how we can do it. We're definitely gonna learn things. That's the point, right? And how can we share these sorts of things with others? So those are a couple of the people aspect things. I mentioned some of the data efforts that we've got. And the next two ones here are straight up iSchool. So I mentioned earlier, it's just like the incredible flood of different sorts of data that's coming into our agency, right? Particularly imagery data. I mentioned there's the number of commercial satellite providers who are getting us all new imagery, Digital Globe, Planet Labs, all sorts of companies who are bringing this sort of stuff in. That's great. For someone like me, a chief data scientist, love it. Bring me more data, right? But then you've got a kind of a question. You're like, well, like, how good is it? Because I know how good the data is coming off of, say, one of the National Reconnaissance Office satellites. I know the quality of that. I know the provenance of that. I know who built the sensor. I know the engineers went to Caltech or whatever. Like, all that kind of stuff, right? So, but we're not the only ones doing that. NGA does that, I mentioned there, but we've got NOAA, we've got NASA, the USDA, and the USGS, Geological Survey. They are all folks in the US government who are interested in getting commercial imagery data, right, from folks. Each one of them could go to, unlabeled here, but all of these commercial satellite providers and say, hey, I'm NOAA, I'm interested in this. I'm NGA, I'm interested in this. We have very different needs, but also some very similar needs. And this is a while back as we recognized, wait, should we as agencies go individually interact with all these different satellite companies? And this is a long time ago when there weren't really that many. Or, how about this, why don't we get together as a group, right? In the sense of trying to figure out how can we signal to these folks what we're interested in, right? It's pretty basic, like fundamental of what we're trying to do is like, what are the standards for imagery that NGA needs as compared to NOAA, right? Hey, I need this certain resolution, NOAA needs this sort of resolution. What sort of metadata do you need? NGA metadata might be different than USGS metadata, or it's maybe more of the same, those sorts of things. Why that's good is we can get together as a group and then signal to, hey, y'all putting satellites up there in space taking pictures, here's what we think is important. If you want to sell stuff to us so that we can get value out of it, here's the list of things that we're interested in. We can be a more informed consumer, buyer, user of this if you go through and literally it's like a list, like a criteria, like a checklist. We're interested in this, they're interested in that. Here's what we see going in the future. So that's JC. Phenomenal group that just kind of came together and did this. And it's one where tremendous value for us as an agency, because just think of the overhead of that. Even when there was a small number of satellite providers, but now they just keep coming, which is really exciting, but then also really scary. Like, how are we going to manage this so we can work with JC and our colleagues to figure out how do we signal with these folks going forward? What's nice too is like other people who are maybe like thinking about starting a satellite company, you're like, I got a crazy idea. I can get some payload on a SpaceX rocket, and I got an idea. Is there a market for what I'm thinking about doing? And you go, well, yeah, like you can go look at the JC spec before you even throw anything up in space and start talking to us, about whether we're going to buy this. So it de-risks that, and also too gets us better data for us doing this type of work. Really exciting space. Another one of these stories that's not really told a whole lot, but straight up iSchool, because you're talking metadata, you're talking standards, you're talking all sorts of things, straight out of John's class on IT ESP there in the back. Next one coming up, again, this is a metadata one. So STAC, what is STAC? So of course, with the government, we got to have some crazy kind of acronyms. Spatiotemporal Asset Catalogs. Whew, that's a chunk, right? What is that? Pretty much I mentioned is like we have imagery data coming down. We have other sorts of remote sensing data that's coming down from satellites, things like that. I mentioned the side of us signaling to those folks, hey, here's what we're interested in, right? But then there's also a bit of a discoverability problem. Like if I'm at NGA and I kind of go like, okay, my analyst is interested in this question. Do we have the data for that? Who would have the data for that? You kind of go, well, here's some of the folks who have filled out the JC stuff, so we've got that. But like, wouldn't it be awesome if there was like a catalog or like a book? So this just started like a couple years ago. Some folks who are getting together with us as folks who are interested in looking through catalogs and buying this sort of data, as well as these commercial satellite providers themselves. And then other folks who are going to do, say, analysis on top of that imagery data and putting it into a literal catalog of this, right? So you can think of that's why I showed a book, because it's not really a book, but it's a spec, right? Of if you want your catalog or your types of remote sensing, geospatial data, whatever it is coming, you want that to be accessible and discoverable by folks, here's the spec, right? So we can figure out what type of sensor you've got, how often it comes down, how it's been secured, all of that. You can put this in the catalog, right? And it's truly a web-based presence where you can go in there. It's still very early on, but the vision is like a web-based presence where you can go in there and key, boom, I need this, I need this, I need this, and boom, it kicks back a list of, here are the different providers that have got that, that you can look at, you can call them up and be able to get that sort of data to come down to you. Amazing solution, particularly now in this sense where we have so many different news sources of data that are coming online. Having something like this, not just for us, but it's just like any geospatial provider, because that's the thing I didn't mention. This is not just like a DoD thing, Department of Defense, not just a US government sort of thing. This is like anybody who would be interested in using geospatial data can access this. They can be part of creating the spec, right, to be able to do this sort of work. So again, if you're a startup and you're interested in doing this type of work, you can go look through the catalog. Hey, I got an idea. I don't want to put my own satellite in space. Maybe I could get it from somebody else. Boom, 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 flip through, pull it out, call them up, get the data that you want to be able to do that. Super cool, super cool. Again, one of these things that's very small and it's just starting, and it's for us as an agency, is like, how do we support and foster that? Can we, as like low stakes, is like, can we get you a space to meet? Right, so all the folks who are interested in doing this, can we get you a space where you can have these sorts of conversations? It gets tricky because we can't really like endorse stuff, right? But it's one of, we can't pick winners and losers and things like that, but we want to provide a space for this to happen because this has value for us. It has value for other folks who are doing geospatial analysis, general analysis, maybe other types of data that come online. They're going to come up with their own version of these sorts of catalogs, right? Is there an IoT catalog? Who knows? There should be, things that we can do there. So that's the data aspect. Next one is I'll go into technology here. There's a lot we could talk about in technology, right, for AI. Our agency launched about, I think it's just over about a year and a half ago, an effort called AAA, in taking that AI and breaking it down into some efforts of what we wanted to do. Starting with automation, right? Simple part of doing AI is just how can we automate the process of getting data that comes into us, right? I mentioned like way back in the day is like literally like a picture would come in, right? So like that doesn't happen anymore. But it's one where it's like we're getting this flood of data, whether from our own satellites or NRO satellites or from the commercial providers. How do we automate the ingest of that? Not so it like comes on a DVD. Like it doesn't, but it's just like, how do we automate the ingest of that data? Because what it is like, this is super time sensitive, Take a picture, it comes down, we want to get that to an analyst as soon as possible, right? How can we automate that process? Some of the numbers I've heard in the last year is we automate about 12 million images a year coming into our agency, right? Pretty good volume of what we're trying to do, continuing to try and scale what that is. You get into the next one then is augmentation. What do I mean by that? So as you automatically ingest this stuff, how do you start augmenting it in the sense of tagging it, right? Simple things of like, what satellite did it come off? Who is it from? Can we do some computer vision to figure out what's in it? Is this a picture of what? Is it urban? Is it a forest? Is it a jungle? All the way down to, is this a tank? Is this a rocket launcher? Is this a boat? What is the direction of the boat? Those sorts of things. What we're doing is bring the data in fast, start to tag and label it, where then you can start doing some really interesting things with like machine learning, right? How do we take what we're doing here and analyze the data that's there because it's well labeled to get some insights, get something out of that? So this is like a multi-stage effort of what the agency is doing. What's really nice is the way that they're doing this is one of like, where do you start? Right? Because of how big or who we are and what we do. So there's a small group of folks who went and started tackling this problem of like, all right, let's how do we automatically ingest this data? How do we start tagging it, right? In the augmentation sense. And how do we start doing small scale things with artificial intelligence to do this? And what I loved in the way that this team worked is one of continually trying to learn from it. Right? So not just like, let's just solve it, but it's just like, okay, what did we learn? We're going to try this to automate the ingest of the data. What did we learn? Our hypothesis, this will work. Okay, this worked or this didn't. What are we going to learn? How are we going to tell our friends? And by our friends, like other people in the agency and other agencies and things like that. So other folks can learn from this process, which is kind of different, kind of new, right? So trying to solve the problem of doing this, but more so is documenting and sharing and spreading the knowledge of how to do these sorts of things. The AAA initiative that we've got at NGA, I was really excited. I was hoping I would have something that I could share with you from the results of that because it recently wrapped up not too long ago. Not quite ready yet to share some of the results of what we've got out of that. But that's another one. It's those folks ideally will be able to share that kind of information with others because you look at other organizations facing similar sorts of challenges. How do I bring this stuff in? How do I tag it? And how do I start doing fill in the blank with that? Folks are thirsty for that sort of knowledge. So that we'll be getting at soon. Last one I'll get into here, and then we can go to some questions, is we got to have our requisite cloud strategy, right? I mean, that's just one of the key things. This is pretty big. Just to say the obvious, is one of taking all this data that we've got through the years that are, I'll say squirreled away, kind of squirreled away in different systems throughout the agency, different parts of the world, right? Different file structures, different storages and things like that. How do we bring that data together into a central spot? We put it in the cloud. We use Amazon C2S, which is their classified cloud-based system that we do. So we're starting to bring that data together. What's key with that is like you can't just dump everything in, right? You got to figure out like, what is this stuff? Where did it come from? What's the provenance of the data? How has it been used? Who touches that data? Because it's used in some sort of way. So that's one of the big efforts that we've got now is using the cloud and then bringing that in and doing it like, I want to say like small scope, but it's like narrow and specific, right? I said, we're not kitchen sinking everything. It's just, because that gets expensive too, and then you get confused. But just one of like, let's bring it in and see how it works for this group or this team. You know, what can we learn from that? What type of tools do they need to use to be able to get access to this? Maybe they were doing something on their desktop on a certain type of computer. Well, if you could put it in Amazon, oh great, you can use Amazon Workspaces, right? You might have used those sorts of things before. Cool, what is the tool suite that you need in an Amazon Workspace, right? That's a challenge, you gotta figure out what those things are. Add the complexity too of we are not like a public company who is out there, who just has, you're an employee and you log in. I didn't mention this, we run on 3 networks. You know, what do I mean by that? So there's like top secret stuff, there's secret stuff, and then there's unclassified, right? So which version of the cloud, right? You know, like where all those tools are. So it gets really complex really fast and how you want to do these things. You can't do them all at once. So it's one of prioritizing, okay, what's that high impact data that would be valuable if we could get it more accessible, could run on faster compute, we could do different analytics, boom, put it in the cloud. Okay, great, find a team who has the capabilities, the skills, the learning, all of that kind of stuff, get them the tools to be able to go install it, because also too is we're in the intelligence community, so it's kind of hard to just like install software on your computer, right? You can't do that, you know, but you can through workspaces, like in different ways, so it's like figuring all that kind of stuff out, right? So those are the efforts that we've got cloud-based, as well as one that's really cool. I love this one. I don't know if folks have seen this before. So it's one of those crazy things that cracks your brain a little bit, where you take the cloud and you put it in a box, right? Go with me. So this is called a snowball edge. I mentioned earlier how we've got users all over the world, right? We've got people on ships. We've got people with very limited connectivity in, say, forward operating bases and things like that, who need to analyze a whole lot of data, right? And how do you do that? You know, you can't beam it over satellite to them. You know, that doesn't work real well. That's really slow, or maybe they can't get a signal or something like that. So Amazon's got a product that we've used a couple times in different instances. We can't share too much of the details of where those places are, but it's truly taking large chunks of data, putting it on this thing, and you can't see it right there, but it has like a FedEx label. We don't FedEx it, but like you could drop that somewhere, plug it in and turn it on, put a monitor and a keyboard on it, and it's like, it's a snapshot of a tremendous volume of data. Like incredible amounts of data with the compute that you need to do, with the tools and the skills, so that our, as we call it, disadvantaged users, is the way we describe that, who don't have fancy computers that are air conditioned and access to a T1, like, no, they don't have any of that kind of stuff. They're in some hard, challenging location. We want to give them the same tools, or as best tools that we can, as the folks who are in the fancy air conditioned spot, right? How do we get those sorts of tools with them? This is a start, right, of doing this sort of work with them. And the style, too, of deploying these things out there and then learning from it, right? Because it's like very few people have done these sorts of things. How do we sit with those folks and learn about how is it really like to use these tools downrange, you know, as we call it, in these sorts of remote locations, and then bringing that back, right? If we can deliver value to this disconnected box in some whatever location in the world, right? That's the goal. Can you help that person make a more informed decision about what they're trying to do? If it's some sort of mission or operation or something like that, awesome. Get the insights back and use that to apply to the situation that you've got in your nice air-conditioned, we call it a skiff type of environment, things like that, right? How do we figure out how to help those users in those sorts of spots? Very small scale effort right now, right? Because this is one where it's like, this is kind of nuts. We're going to try this. There's a lot of security concerns with this, a lot of transportation, logistics concerns, things like that, finding the right folks who like know what to do with that, right? You know, it's like you got to find that right community of folks. And our agency has found a bundle of those folks and are working with them. And again, documenting and learning and how do we scale it, right? Before we commit too far to doing these sorts of things, before we put too much on it, too much expectation, start small, learn, share with our colleagues, other parts of the IC and things like that, talk publicly about it. The guy who ran this had a public talk last year at Amazon's big conference in Las Vegas, reInvent. I highly recommend folks go look at that, where he goes into greater detail about how this worked and what didn't. Fascinating stuff. You know, and it's like that's where we're going from a technology standpoint to help with different sorts of things. Wrapping here, and then we can go into some questions because I imagine you might have some. Kind of a hypothesis, right, to some degree. Own that, right? How do we deal with these challenges, these adversaries that we face, right, as a member of the intelligence community, Department of Defense? It comes down to really these 3 things of people, data, and technology. And I say it like in that order, right? So much what you can look at is like, hey, let's use some technology to go solve X, right? And you kind of see what happens with that, right? You're missing the social context of things, right? And it's go, no, let's flip it. Let's start with the people part. How do we best understand what our people are doing, right? The problems that they face, the challenges that they have, the skills that they have, what they're worried about, right? Building relationships with those folks. Let's empower them, right? So that they feel comfortable with what we're doing, right? Next on top of that is go to the data part, right? I mentioned a couple things there. How do we make sure that we've got clean, solid data that we can do things with? You know, at the end of the day, can I get a good, a person, an analyst, some quality data to look at? And it could be in a spreadsheet or something like that. Do they have the ways to analyze that data to get some insights out of that? That's the baseline. Let's do that. Get our data ready to go, draw down our data debt, get that all set, right? Because that person's going to be more informed than before. Great, once we got those things figured out, let's go to the technology part, right? And that's almost adding oxygen to this whole fire, if you want to call it that, of like, great, you've got super capable, smart people who are learning all these skills. You got them the data that they need to be able to make more informed decisions. And then now we just start putting technology in there. And it's technology that's aware of the people who are using it, the limitations, the affordances of the data that they've got, right? Why are we doing it, or why am I putting it in this way? It's really to de-risk things. Like I really mentioned, is like how risky what we're trying to do, right? We can't just throw technology at some of these super high-end, high-risk decisions questions that we've got. If we don't have the people who are informed to do it, don't know how to do it, we don't have the data that's labeled to be able to do that, can't do it. It's too risky. We're not drawing, I'll say it, little lines on maps or matching ads and things like that. This is super high stakes. And the hypothesis is we de-risk that by focusing these efforts on the people part, the data part, and the technology part. So that covered a lot. There's a lot there. Happy to answer any questions about that. There are other initiatives that I may be able to speak about a little bit, but these are some of our more public ones. I really thank the opportunity to come and talk. I thank my NGA folks for being game to me come and talk. You know, in these, when I took the job at the agency, I was like, I think we need to be more public in what we're doing. And they were game for that, which I really support. I know it makes them uncomfortable sometimes, is having folks out speaking publicly about our efforts. But like I mentioned, this is one of the things. We're not the only ones facing these challenges or problems. You have ideas, inputs on how we can be smarter about how we do this, right? How can we learn from folks who are out there and really take some of the mystique off of what we're trying to do, you know, to help with that. So thank you. I appreciate, Anno, the chance to come and talk. My committee folks, like I mentioned, you know, when I was here through the program and so forth, so many people were part of this work that I do each day. And it's almost kind of comical. We'll all be in meetings and things like that. And people will be like, where did you learn about metadata? You know, it's like a high school bingo game sometimes. And they'll be like, why did you call them out on what the value was on the survey? Like, had you done that before? And you're like, oh yeah, I took a survey, 273, or those sorts of things. And it's just one where it's such a tremendous opportunity. And it's one where for other folks who are going into where they would go next in school and things like that, so many possibilities of places you can go, whether it's DOD or other sorts of things with your iSchool skills. So thank you. I'll cut it there and then take questions. Thanks.
I'm sure you have lots of questions already, but he encourages us to ask bold questions. He may not be able to answer them all.
Yes, I will try my best to answer everything. And,
yes.
And there will be some that I probably cannot answer,
Yeah.
and I will just say that. I'll try and be frank on that. I will ask if you can say it's just like, if you're comfortable with saying your name and your background. I recognize you might not be comfortable saying that. Someone in the IC, that's okay. I respect that. And one of my friends always says this, please phrase your question in the form of a question. So there you go.
Thank you. So I'm Brent Durbin. I'm a visiting scholar here at the iSchool. I'm a political scientist, and I work on intelligence. But my question has to do with the challenges of keeping up with ethical standards and government regulation of big data, and specifically in your world, how, I know that there are government controls on the kind of shutter control, like resolution of satellites that can be purchased commercially, and the extent to which the government has been able to keep up with the proliferation of commercial satellites and the ability to use data analytic techniques to improve resolution, or whether that's kind of gone with the wind, that you no longer can really keep a lid on what people can do in terms of acquiring resolution outside of the government.
So what was the question?
So how do you see this space in regulatory terms? Like, and I know it's not specifically NGA's job to do this.
Yeah.
But NGA has a big, presumably, interest in keeping proprietary access to some of the high resolution.
Sure. Okay. Got it. Okay. So thank you. Thank you for
others
rephrasing.
might be able to get to.
I think I got it. So I'll speak narrowly on this one. The way that I look at it from the chief data scientist side, right, is I recognize industry is moving at super fast speed, right? We, for a long time, have had, I'll use the word monopoly control on having super high-res satellites, right? We've had that for a long time. That's eroding, or that dynamic is changing. The economist in me goes like, let's go engage with those folks, right? And bring together, whether it's NRO, who's made super high-res satellites, and they were the only ones who made those, is having that dialogue conversation with the commercial folks themselves, right? And just saying, it's like, hey, what I need, my need is this. The provider used to be this one over here. Here's some other stuff that's coming. I recognize what regulation says over here. We need to get the right people in the room to update the regulation to the reality of the situation that we've got, right? The challenge is finding the right folks to be in the room for that. And having, I would say, is like, not the right word, but it's like the literacy to engage in that kind of conversation. One where they have the awareness of recognition of what's going on outside. And that's a bit of a challenge, right? Because really in the IC is, you come and you join the IC and you stay in that world and it's protected, you know, and it's one where just getting that engagement to the outside and being like, that's the reality, that's kind of the hardest part. You know, is finding those right folks and then getting together in that space to have that conversation of, well, here's the reality of what's going on, right? And what are we going to do about that? And what are those levers or changes that we need to make with regard to regulations and why, right? You know, how do we do that? It's hard. You know, it's a very hard effort. The one that I look at is just like in my role is illuminating what those things are and trying to get the right people in the room to have that conversation. You know, here's where we are. We need to start dealing with this now because it's moving super fast. We can't form a working group that starts in 6 months or something like that. Like, no, like we need to get on the phone right now and get the right people in the room to start having that discussion and dialogue, right? Yeah. Hopefully that answered. Okay. Yeah.
Can you expound a little bit on the relationship between ethics and doctrine? My prior about applied ethics in a DoD context is that it's mediated through doctrine within the branches, and I'm curious if there's doctrine that's specific to the IC or specific to NGA or even specific to data-driven process.
Like, what do you mean by how? Let's unpack doctrine. What do you mean? Like literally documented or?
Yeah. So, for example, within the branches, there are ideas about how we should and shouldn't use force and when people should and shouldn't pull the trigger
Yes.
in real applications.
Okay. So good question. So the way I'll hear that land or phrase is like, with regard to using new forms of technology, put it in there. How does that align with certain doctrine, let's say, on exactly in the examples you described? What I would say at this point is we're bringing in what that old, that existing doctrine is and trying to pair that up with the reality of what we've got. So like I mentioned, it's on like the analyst sorts of discussions, right? So we have certain checks and balances in place. What is our doctrine or our process on how we make certain decisions, right? Other people have to check stuff. You have to have it vetted, right? How do you embody that? What's the relationship between that process and what's in technology? My understanding is, my sense right now is we're still going through those discussions and conversations, right? And it's a recognition of like, we have the old ones that we have before, let's use that to best guide us. And in situations where we start bumping that, where they're bumping, or as I describe it, things are awkward, right? Is like raising that and illuminating that within even groups within the agency or other parts, saying like, hey, here's the old model that we would, where we are right now. What do we do? In that sense, and coming together with a conversation, and then with like our general counsel, our legal folks, for guidance on that. That's one of the key things I really found like in this agency and our work, and this is shared with my colleagues in the CIA and the NSA. And it's really one where, I'm not speaking for them, but it's just in my experience with these. When things get awkward, right, people start talking and engaging and going to the right folks for guidance. And that's not always a story that's really told. Outside in the public or really seen. It kind of seems like, oh, you follow this process and you just go do it. And no, I've been there where people are having a conversation, you're like, this feels weird. Like, I don't feel comfortable with this. And you're like, okay, good, let's talk about this. Like, we got to figure out what this is and just pause it and get the right folks in the room to guide us. So that's kind of a long answer to where we are. But it's one where it's like, we've got the existing doctrine of what we have the reality of what it's like today, and try to get the right folks in the room to how do we update that doctrine to being today and honoring what was in that original doctrine and why it was created. How do we update that with the values that we have today and what were in those values before? Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Brooks. I'm Ross. I'm a graduating undergrad here, and I'm a student of Jesse Rosenbaum. He wanted to say hi, but he's out of town today. Okay. So my question is, so I know the military right now has retention problems with, for example, the cyber force and the pilots. With the NGA, like you mentioned when you first went in, you found that like working there, the workflows are very different, and the agency clearly emphasizes taking care of its people. But what kind of strategies have been effective in, I guess, building up your data core and talent retention and because I think that is an issue that's in the government sector, and
Yeah.
I'm just really curious what
I get
your
that one a
insights
lot.
are.
How did you hire so many people so quick? That's the short version of the question, right? Well, one is what I did is kind of adopting when I've been in prior situations of hiring and recruiting folks. One is putting out general calls. We have to make sure that we're regulations on how we hire, which is very different in the startup world, or the tech world, very different sorts of things. But one is really working with our recruiting folks to try and figure out, like, here's what I need, here's where to go get them. Do general calls, here are the types of keywords that you want, and staying very close to those folks, right? So getting getting a net and getting as many folks as we could get in there. One of the things that the team did as well, because we're all data guys, data folks, is one of doing, which hadn't really been done in the agency, is like kind of simple stuff of like keyword matching, right? And pulling things out and not using that for gospel, of whether someone's a candidate or things like that, but stripping those out and getting it to piles, and then going and calling and talking to those folks, in guidelines of our regulations and things. One of the things I found is, it's frankly, it can be hard to recruit folks to come work for the federal government right now. It can be hard to get recruit folks to come join the Department of Defense, intelligence community, all of those things are super challenging, right? What I would say, I would just kind of just own that and just being like, what, I can't pay you as much. Like, I can't. That's the reality. I can't pay you as much as Uber or Facebook, right? We're kind of doing something kind of crazy. Like, this is an adventure, like what we're trying to do, right? Like, if you want to come into a place where it's like, this is super high stakes, right? This is what I was like, so like, how good a data scientist are you? In the sense of like, ad matching, yeah, you gotta be pretty good. But like, seriously, like, we'll get in situations where we've got one of the folks that I hired, it was like super high stakes. And it's like, how good are you? I wish I could say her name, tell her story, but it was like, she was really good. And she was from industry. She had worked in New York, had some interesting ideas, had worked in, I can't say the name of the industry, but it was very applicable to the project that we had right now. And just saying like, hey, you've done some sweet stuff here, let's up the stakes here a little bit. You really want to try and see how hard it is, really? And one, too, that would work on my recruiting, so that was effective. But also, too, is recognizing is like, hey, come join us for a period of time, right? Come and join us, for like 3 years or 4 years or something like that, right? Work on some crazy, awesome stuff. Get some amazing skills. Get some idea of what the federal government's like, what the intelligence community is like, the people who are like, and things like that. And as I would describe it, in that work while you're there, maybe you'll come up with some crazy idea that would make our stuff better, right? And maybe you'll go start a company, right? Go start a company, find some technology, something like that, sell it back to us. That gets weird, but just one of like, go out there and do other amazing things with that. By the way, on the way out the door, can you tell me a couple of your friends who you think are really good, who can come back? And that's happened. Like, that's happened. That's a natural part of startups or like any small teams, particularly like with DataCore. They've been on there like a year or so. They kind of roll off and do other things, and it's like, it was great having you on the team. You did some amazing high impact stuff. Who else is like you? Who else can I kind of bring in? So I mean, I can go into great detail much more on the recruiting part. There were other things that we did too on the clearance process, because that can be very lengthy to get folks on board to come and join us. But I just kind of took a service design approach to the whole thing. It was very iSchool. Just like when we get these folks in and you'd offer them a job, right? You kind of go into the security process, which can kind of be scary. You got to fill out this big form, and they'll ask you questions about, hey, who rented you an apartment in college? All this kind of stuff. What I learned when I was doing mine, which was really fast, is like if there's one error, all of a sudden you're taking the long roads. I don't know if you played Candyland like as a kid, right? But there's like the good path and then there's the long path, right? So like what we would do is de-risk it and be like, hey, someone's gonna call. They're gonna ask if you have all this stuff. So between now and that phone call, you start digging up everything you've got about these sorts of things. So you fill that form out once and you submit it, and then you will get cleared faster. So I mean, all sorts of stuff we can talk about, but it's really like coming at it from a data angle, service design angle, things like that. So, but I can go into more detail. Yeah. Question, yeah, Stuart.
So I'm curious to know, so when you talk about ethics, a lot of things that you've said have been very kind of like you have like a positive or an affirmative moral obligation to kind of get it right, or get it done like, get it right, get it fast, get it done, to the right people, that sort of, and actually it's interesting because I don't hear that kind of thing in a lot of the conversations, and I'm curious about ethics. And so I'm curious, aside from the kind of prohibition on like domestic surveillance, what other kinds of things maybe you can't talk about? Maybe this is something you can't talk about, but like, are there any other things that are like either legal or not formalized, but the same kind of doctrine or morals that people have about saying that would restrict the kind of things that you could do, even though it might increase your accuracy or things like that?
Sure, okay, so I'll try and Yeah, so a lot of that I probably can't talk about. But it's just one of what I would look at when it comes to like the ethics of using AI, right? You know, is it breaking that down into one where it's like, is it legal? No, it's not really a legal thing, but it impacts the folks you work with, right? In the sense because it's one where it's like, we can do some crazy stuff with computer vision, right? You know, in the sense that we can figure out, is that a tank or is this or what? And whatever is that sort of picture, that's way better than the person who is known as the best tank detector, right? Things like that. Is that ethics? Like, I don't know. There's one where it's a certain ethics on using technology to automate things. You know, and how do we feel about that? Because that's like your buddy. Like, that's somebody that you're working with, things like that. So maybe that's a different lens on the ethics part. But it's one where I kind of go, is like, if it's ethics or not, it's like, take the label off. And you kind of go, it's like, we're using technology that's going to disrupt the workforce, right? The people that were there, we need to engage with those folks to say, hey, this is what's happening. Here's how we can help you. Here's how we can involve you. One of the things that I'm really interested in is like, kind of like, so wait, who's the best person who can figure out which tank is what? Like, how do we, let's go hang out with that person. Like, how did they figure that out? Like, what is all of that knowledge? Not to suck it all out and put it into an algorithm. No, it's the pairing of those two things. So it's like, how do we bring in this technology to help augment the analysts who are really good at doing this work to make them like super smart and really good at doing this? So it's one where it's like, is it ethics or not? Like, maybe we can get really academic and figure out what it is, but it's one of those, it's like, something that we're doing with this technology is potentially disrupting someone else or a team or society and things like that, and what are we going to do about that? How do we, you know, recognize that, and then making a conscientious decision with stakeholders about, are we going to go down this path and not just automatically doing it? So hopefully that maybe kind of answered your question, but it's one where it's like, we can really unpack what ethics is. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Brandon. I'm an undergrad doing data science. And I was wondering, this kind of goes off of the last question. When you obtain data from a third party, are they bound by the same data collection restrictions that the NGA might be bound by?
Can you be more specific?
So if a private corporation supplies you with image data of a certain location, and it was, because you mentioned that the NGA isn't allowed to collect data on citizens, so if that data is included in data that's obtained from a third party, then are there restrictions on your ability to
Good question.
that?
Yeah. So like, okay. So like focusing on that one, like we cannot connect, we do not and we cannot collect and analyze data about US persons. There are very few exceptions to that for like humanitarian response, things like that. But let's just focus on the ones where it's, well, you don't and we can't. So when we go to third parties and go get stuff, we'd be like, see all this? That applies to you too. Right? So like if we're gonna bring in your data, or you're gonna sell it to us, it has to abide by this. Don't be mixing in US person data in here. We will come and find you. That's bad. We know, like, we can't. And that's one that we hold very firm and true. And that's one where I look at from a data scientist side. Yeah, it's amazing. It's awesome. We've got all this kind of data coming in. We can use it in all these different sort of ways. But I'm not a hedge fund where I can just take in whatever. It has to adhere to all these existing rules. And what's big challenge is going from, like I mentioned, those specs. Like, you can imagine a spec. Does it contain US persons? Yes or no? You're like, that's not a box. Like, you know, you can't check yes or no on that. It's one of like getting those folks that who are collecting this data in these companies to really understand how important that is, right? Because we don't do that. It is against the law. How do we take our laws and the way that we work and function? How do you get and signal that and get the buy-in from those commercial providers? It's hard, other than really working with them directly to say, like, you can't send that stuff to us. Like, you just can't, and here's why. And if you want to work with us, you need to adhere to that law.
So Andy, this has been really interesting. I mean, I really appreciate that you're out here speaking and that you're trying to open these things up. I mean, you're bringing so much of the 21st century to an agency that, I mean, for me, the intelligence agency is sort of from movies from the 50s and 60s. So I'm curious if you can just tell us a little bit about what we don't know about the intelligence community. Like, what are things that we should know that we don't know about?
Yeah, it was one, I kind of, maybe it's building off of the one I mentioned earlier. It's just one of these where it is folks who are trying their hardest to do the work, and having these kind of awkward conversations. I'll describe it as like, how do we feel about this? And are we going to do this? Is this the right way? And illuminating those things. That kind of stuff can't really be told a whole lot, And so part of that's a cultural thing, because some of my colleagues, they can't really even say where they work, right? Raising and sort of having those conversations and being isolated, they can't. What we are starting to see, though, is people opening up and being maybe more public about who they are and what they do and where they're doing it, which has some risk trade-offs right now. But that I would say is the number one surprising thing is, coming into that world where it is one where it's like, yeah, people think about these things. Like you'll be, time out, we got to have a discussion about X or Y. What is the law? Are you sure this doesn't have US persons? We're not going anywhere. Like, these are real examples. Like, we're not going anywhere unless, like, I think so? That's not good enough. Like, no. Like, we have to do these sorts of things. So that's one where I would say is if you can give a better, give the US public and the world an insight into how our tradecraft works, it is one of those. It's like the checks and balances that goes into that. What we do to make sure that what we're providing to someone has gone through an audited, clear process that is, like, reproducible. Like a straight up scientific method way with like notebooks and everything. I can go into super detail on how all of it works, but you can unpack. Something goes into a presidential daily briefing that says X or Y, you can trace that all the way back, to who did it and the provenance of all of that kind of stuff. And that would be one I'd love to be able to just shine a light on that, of the thoughts that go into that and how deliberate it is. And maybe it's slow, but it's very conscientious and aware and deliberate and informed, is really telling those sorts of stories. Yeah.
Out of all the lists of projects that you guys kind of tackle, how do you guys kind of decide which is the most important, which is something we should tackle next?
Got it. So like from the data core side, the problems that we've got, yeah, that's a hard one. How do you measure value? Return, right? I mean, that's basically what this is how do you measure the value of the return of the work that we've got? The way that I would do it is or how we did it in the team functions now is really one of what's the fastest way we can learn? Right, quickly, because this, doing a team like this has never been done in the intelligence community. There's a lot of people who are interested in how this works. How do we get the most insight from this and be able to learn and share with others what works and what doesn't work, right? So we would do it as when we started, it's I need a 3-day project, right? Super small scope. And people are like, why? I got some big thing. You're like, well, we got to figure out, we have a hunch that we should put these 4 work roles on it. I described what they are. We got a hunch that it's this. And the best way we're going to learn is if we can do something quickly and deliver customer, and then it can say yes or no, and then we can go bang, let's do another one. So I always be careful. I go, is it agile? No. It's tight iterative loops. So that's the way the model of the problems that the team would solve first is one of do we have access to the data? Is the customer raring to go? So that was one of the jokes is you would email us and we'd pick up the phone and be like, we're coming down. Which would scare people in the federal government. Oh, I didn't think you would get back to me for a week. And we're like, what's your cube? We're on our way. So that's someone that you would want to work with. Because again, we're trying to do super fast loops that then we could share with other folks. Because this started with 5 of us, and then it grew to 12, and then it's 20. So you're constantly growing and learning and sharing that with others. The best way we found to do that is these small, tight projects that you could do something. You sit with a customer, you say, did this deliver value for you? And they'd be like, yes or no. Right? And you go, is there something that you can do next? Great, here's the tools to go learn how to do that and keep building that as we go. If you took super long projects, right, that would be 3 months, it'd be too far. The team would, there was at one point where the team grew from 20 to 50 people in a month. You can't be running projects in that sense. So very tight iterative loops. Now that the team has matured, the team is taking on more complex, longer ones, but originally it was that super tight iterative feedback loop. That's what we did.
And a follow-up, so the companies and their people that you work with, are they outside of the government or are they all sort of within the government?
Which sort of companies?
The ones that you're working for and sort of consulting. Yeah.
Oh, who else do we support? Yeah, so we, so Department of Defense. So as I mentioned, all the slide up there of all the 16 different ones, we provide intelligence to them, as well as Congress or any sort of decision maker can come to us. Hey, we need insights on this. Can you help us out? Department of Homeland Security, other folks will come to us for that. A commercial company, they couldn't come and buy our product. We're not in that sort of space right now. One of the efforts that we're trying to do is I'm working on is one of for our data is making it available to folks. So it's because we've collected and analyzed it, and you're a U.S. taxpayer, so it belongs to you. So hey, here's some data. Go do things with it. So that's something that we're kind of stepping our toe into. It's hard to do that, because we're classified with the intelligence community. But it's just one of getting those sorts of things out there. But the primary is that 16 circle that I showed you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ooh, sorry. Is there any back and forth?
Yeah, so yeah, really good question. So that's where it goes on the humanitarian response stuff. I know anecdotally of instances where there has been disaster response. One I was familiar with is like when there was an earthquake in Nepal a number of years ago, the folks who were on the ground there contacting NGA and being like, hey, what's up with the airfields? Things like that. So that's one where it's, yeah, like NGOs can work with our folks to help get information, answers like that. My understanding and my sense of what that is not like raw data, and pushing that sort of things out, but much more of, we call it product. So here's a report about what's going on in the world to guide those things. One I see as a mission charter is like, those are customers and users of our data. How do we get more of that sort of stuff out? So I mentioned is like making our data available to commercial folks, and it's NGOs. For that is, I can get you super high res, timely data about different parts of the world. How do I get that to you in some way? Right now it's kind of a prioritization of our other missions that we have and things like that. But for me personally, I think it's a really key one for us. And it's one for us, we're uniquely positioned in the intelligence community to do that. We can provide that sort of insight to folks. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Carla Mays. My company is Mays Civic Innovation, and then I have a research project called Smart Cohort, where we work on public sector, getting public sector boned up on this kind of stuff so that they can make better decisions. One of the questions is I've been working on disasters, and I've been particularly in Florida, and you were talking a lot about runways and things like that, but we have lots of areas, homes that have been like really, they're soft structures now. We've got another hurricane season that's coming. Are there things that you're doing in your capacity or inside the agency where they're actually looking at okay, we're gonna have more storms, we've got houses that are damaged, and that what are some of the intelligence for the insurance companies and other agencies, or at least getting ready for the upcoming hurricane season?
Got it. So the way, so let me abstract that a little bit. So it's just like, are we doing that in Florida? No, because U.S. persons. We're not. But I would say as an agency, we have a responsibility to make sure decision makers are informed of, say, climate change and disaster in different parts of the world. Keep it abstract, right? So some of the efforts, things that we would be interested in doing, and some efforts have been made in this, is how can we start analyzing overhead imagery to figure out what types of buildings are in different types of places, things like that, and getting some smarts and intelligence. That has some definite DoD implications of things, right? Like, how tall is the building? That's one. What kind of structure is it and things like that? So it's one where I describe it. That's the primary use of that sort of data, but very quickly you can come into other things where you kind of go, well, wait, like if it's this type of building, that would maybe have, if this happened in the world climate-wise or environmentally or storm-wise or something, this is what would happen there. It does, yeah. So that's one, again, is I'll abstract off. So like Florida, no, can't. But as other parts of the world is doing, I'll say scenario planning, and Steve will kill me, but Steve Weber, but it's not scenario planning in that sense, but it's just thinking through what would happen. What would we do? In this part of the world, if this sort of thing happened, because there likely would be some sort of mobilized response, how would we think through, do we have the data for that? Do we have the compute for that? What sort of decisions or questions are there to be able to help folks make more informed decisions? My understanding is there's some sort of efforts in that way, but again, it gets like there's a list of things that we can work on, and and it's just like we call it out and put it on the list, and that's where I go, is like us as an agency, you kind of go, it's like, well, how can we help? How can we get other people to help us with this? Because other folks are interested in doing this. Are there ways? And this is like some ideas, thoughts. Like, we're not doing this right now, but it's one of like, is there ways that we can take this sort of data and make it available to folks to be able to run the run the analytics themselves? Like, I gotta. It's just like, how do we do that? Like, that's hard, to do it. But I would love to do that. Like, I want other people to be able to create value out of our data, particularly for disaster response, things like that. Yeah, so, cool. Okay, yes.
Hey, Andy, thanks so much for your talk. My name's Rachel Wesson. I work with the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity.
Hi, Rachel.
Speaking of Steve Weber and scenario planning over at CLTC, one of the questions that we have been asking a lot of our workshop participants in these Cyber Futures 2025 workshops we've been holding, I'll kind of abstract it out, is what is the upside? And so whether it's in your role or as your role as a citizen or your role at NGA or in the intelligence community larger, what's the upside? What are you most excited about?
Yeah.
And what keeps you up at night?
So the one I'm most excited about is one where it's like every day is like an adventure. Like as kind of like hokey as that sounds, like it really is. Like the conversations that you'll be involved in, and not just like location or things like that, which can be really cool. But it's just one where you're like, I'm really excited by, like, as I joked, is like you can just drop a, like, there's something that we can do with metadata that'll make the world better over here. There's something that I can draw on from interviewing user experience research skills. This door kickers trying to do, things like that. That's what gets me really excited. Like every day, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, and you're going to draw on so many different tools to be able to do that. Like that's just amazing. Like that's awesome. Like the upside of that is just tremendous because you go, there's so many different things to work on. What keeps me up at night is there's so many things to work on. You know, like really, like that's really one of the things is like, how do you prioritize it? Or ideas and things like that. And it's one of like, it's a large organization and we got a lot of people we got to keep happy, you know, and it's like, how do we prioritize the work of what we're trying to do, to whom, right? And how do we measure the impact of that? That's what gets really hard, you know, for us. And it's one where I go is, I try to focus my efforts on those folks where if we don't do it right, their life could change dramatically, right? And that's one where I kind of go. You know, it's just in that sort of sense. And that's, you know, and it's, I mentioned it's like for our military folks and things like that, or our operators and things, that's where I go. You know, is I kind of start with that. Like each day is like, how can I help make an operator or one of those folks who's making that decision in the range where things could go sideways for them and really radically change their life or other people's lives, right, that they could be engaging with? How do I help make their life better? What's that going to take? You know, and that's one of the things that keeps me up is one of those is like you worry about that. You know, it's like, did I help enough of those people today? You know, which gets kind of heavy. But it's like there's so many things to work on, and then how do you focus your efforts is on that. So kind of a long answer, but yeah.
Any
Okay.
last questions here? This has been really fantastic. I want to just thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good. Thank you.